Love will not be constrained by mastery. When mastery comes, the god of love anon beateth his wings, and farewell, he is gone. Love is a thing, as any spirit free. This is Pints with Jack, Season 9, Episode 28. Jack's Bookshelf, Chaucer. After Hours with Dr. Simon Horobin.
Have you been looking everywhere, searching for a place where you belong? Away from the masses, among clinking glasses, where the hearth fire is on. Let the laughter welcome you in, that eagle and child din. There's room at this table, so take a seat and tuck right in. Pints with Jack. Pints with Jack.
Welcome, friends, to Pints with Jack. Today we continue snooping through Jack's bookshelf, and today we've discovered Chaucer in C.S. Lewis's library. And helping us understand Chaucer is C.S. Lewis's successor at Magdalen, Dr. Simon Horobin. Dr. Simon Horobin is a British philologist and professor of English language and literature at the University of Oxford and a fellow of Magdalen College. His research explores the history and development of the English language, including spellings, dialects, and the works of Geoffrey Chaucer. His works highlight how English has evolved and continues to shape culture and communication. And he is the author of C.S. Lewis's Oxford and co-author of Wardrobes and Rings with Malcolm Guite and Dr. Julia Golding. Dr. Horobin, welcome to Pints with Jack.
Thanks for having me.
Well, it's been a while since you've been on Pints with Jack. I actually recently interviewed Dr. Julia Golding about one of your recent joint ventures. So would you mind just filling in what's happened since you were last on the show?
Sure, yeah. So the book you just mentioned there is called Wardrobes and Rings, Lent with the Inklings. And it came out of a Lent course that Julia Golding and I ran at St Andrew's Church here in Oxford. And we then were interested in publishing the studies that we'd produced and got together with Malcolm Guite, and we each wrote some entries separately. And then we gathered at Magdalen College in my rooms to co-write some of the others, which was a wonderful experience. And that book has now just come out, sort of strangely in time for Christmas, but actually a Christmas present ahead of the Lent season.
Yes, yeah. By the time that this interview comes out, we'll just be on the other side of Lent, and I'm hoping to speak to Reverend Guite just before Lent starts. So I'm trying to punctuate it, like when it comes out, just before Lent and on the other side.
Wonderful.
And what else have you been up to? I see happenings going on with the Romanian conference.
Yes, last month I was lucky enough to go to Iași in Romania to attend the conference there on C.S. Lewis and kindred spirits, which it's been going for, I think, about 15 years now. And an amazing gathering, in fact, of wonderful speakers, some well-known names in the Lewis world. So people like Malcolm Guite himself was there, Jim Beitler, the director of the Wade Centre, James Como, along with people from all over Eastern Europe, where there's a huge interest in C.S. Lewis, and from people from the US, even people from Australia. So it was an amazing gathering and lots of younger scholars, which was incredibly encouraging to see not just kind of scholarly papers, but also a range of creative responses, musical art, and so on, lots of poetry.
Yeah, I do wonder if we're going to start seeing these sort of mini revivals in other parts of the world. I've interviewed several people who are involved with C.S. Lewis in France, and they say he's virtually unknown here. So I wonder if at some point they're going to catch fire as well. Yeah,
well, exactly. Anne Frederic, who is organising a conference in June, I think, in France, is one that was also at this conference and is part of that sort of that new revival, I think, that's happening there in France. So it's exciting. Last year I was interviewed for a podcast or for a radio program by a Belgian journalist who said exactly the same thing. That was the purpose of it, was to come to Oxford and find out about Lewis and really try and wonder why it is that he's virtually unknown in Belgium.
Yeah. And the France one I've always found a little darkly funny because Lewis had been there. I mean, it wasn't under the best of circumstances, but he had visited France. So I think the very least that they could do is return the favor by reading more of his books.
Yeah, exactly. Well, that conference, there will be a visit to the battlefields where Lewis and Tolkien both fought.
Wow. Oh, so cool. So cool. So many great things. Are you drinking anything today? It's rather cold here in Wisconsin, so I have a hot chocolate going.
Well, I've got a cup of tea in the mug that I was given at the Yash conference. So that felt very appropriate. And like C.S. Lewis and also like Johnson, I'm a hardened and shameless tea drinker whose kettle scarce has time to cool.
Did you want to know something really horrible? This morning, I went to make a cup of tea and there were only 2 tea bags left. I made a cup of tea for myself and my wife, and then we immediately started calling around to see who has Yorkshire Gold tea that we could steal. Fortunately, my mother-in-law has come in clutch, so we will be okay. But it was it was touch and go there for a moment. Well, cheers.
Cheers.
Now, we'll get back to C.S. Lewis eventually, but this is part of the Jack's Bookshelf month, so we are snooping through his books, and today we are talking about Geoffrey Chaucer. So to begin with, could you mind paint the scene for us? Who is this man? What do we know about him? And where does he fit into the world of literature?
Sure, yeah. We know surprisingly a large amount about Geoffrey Chaucer, especially compared to his contemporaries. So he was born in the 1340s. We don't actually know exactly when. All we can go on is that in 1386 he appeared in a court representing a court case, and he was asked his age, and he gave it as 40 years and more, which was wonderfully precise.
Oh, I'm adopting that. Yeah, yes.
Exactly. No, I'm still 40 years and more, even in my 50s. So yeah, we don't know precisely, but we do know he died in 1400, very conveniently. So it's an easy date to remember. So he lived in the sort of the latter half of the 14th century, and he was born in London in Upper Thames Street. His father was a vintner working in the wine trade. The reason we know a lot about him is that he worked in and around the royal court. So there are actually some 500 life records relating to Geoffrey Chaucer that name him. But strikingly, not one of them references his poetry or him as a poet. We just know about him as a kind of bureaucrat, really. So he started off life as a page working around the royal court. He then became a sort of senior civil servant. He kept record of duty paid on wool exports in his own hand. It was a pretty demanding job. He had to just sort of tally up and make sure that the accounts were properly kept up. And then he became the clerk of the King's Works, which meant he was responsible for the upkeep of royal buildings like Westminster Palace and St. George's Chapel and things. He had to sort of ride around the countryside, keeping an eye on building work and making sure people were paid on time and so on. So he was a kind of royal functionary, and that was his day job. That's what he spent most of his time doing. And in fact, in one of his poems, there's a sort of bit of biographical insight in the House of Fame, where he talks about having spent his day in the counting house doing his reckonings. He says that instead of going home to do newer things, he actually sits dumb as any stone at another book till fully daswed is his look, he says. So he's basically writing in the evenings until he's just completely exhausted. And there's no evidence that the writing is connected to the royal work, although, of course, it's sort of tempting to think that he was in some way being patronized by some of the royalty that he came into contact with. So, for instance, Edward III gave him as a sort of sign of royal favor a pitcher of wine a day for life. It was a kind of,
wow.
Yeah, I mean, what a way to be paid. So that's like basically a gallon of wine every day. And he could go along. He worked by the port when he was controller of the wool custom. He would turn up there, presumably with his pitcher, and they would fill it up. And but it's probably just for royal services generally. I mean, he was relatively important. He travelled on the king's business overseas. He was actually kidnapped at one point and held hostage, and the king paid his ransom. He was sort of quite connected with Richard II's administration as well. When he was the controller of the wool customs, he was living in a grace and favour house on Aldgate, above the old one of the gates to the old City of London walls. So they were quite important and sort of well connected. Of course, Richard II then became he was under fire in the 1380s by people who wanted to, largely because of his kind of tendency to reward his favourites and to be somewhat tyrannical as a leader. And a number of Chaucer's close associates were found guilty of treason and killed. And Chaucer, because he seems to have been quite politically savvy, managed to dodge all of that. In fact, he had given up his job and moved out of his accommodation on the Aldgate just before all of this happened. So he obviously saw something coming in the wind and moved accordingly. And then, of course, ultimately in 1399, Richard is deposed and murdered, and Henry IV takes over. And there's a very witty poem that Chaucer wrote to Henry IV at that point. It's a complaint to his purse, because he's complaining that his purse is empty, because the annuity that he was getting, the annual salary that he got from Richard, hadn't been confirmed since the change of king. And he sort of then addresses Henry at the end of it and basically says, you're the true king by lineage and free election, which is a somewhat convenient way of trying to look at someone who's essentially by usurping and killing the former king. But it worked. Henry then sort of duly renewed his annuity and the purse becomes heavy again. And so he was, he moved around the royal court and knew how to be quite politically savvy, I think. And so it's sort of hard for us to connect all of these things to his poetry, but there's clearly some relationship.
Mm-hmm. And if you had to sort of sum it up, what is it that makes him such an important author that people should know?
Well, I suppose in his time, that 14th century period, the use of English as a kind of literary medium was rather rare because, of course, if you go back to the beginning of this is what we call the Middle English period, the 1100 to 1500, so he's right at the end of it. The beginning of it is very dominated by French culture following the Norman Conquest, and all kind of literary writing at that point was largely dominated by French. And so he's really part of a revival of the use of English within that kind of literary culture. He's not the only person doing it, but it becomes a very important one. And he's therefore, in a sense, creating a market for writing in English amongst a much more kind of upwardly mobile monolingual English culture that emerged at that period. So he's sort of, he doesn't single-handedly save English from the French or anything. It's not quite that nationalistic, but he's a very important force behind the reemergence of English. And he's very influential in many of the writers that come after him. So John Lydgate, Thomas Hoccleve, people who are not particularly well known today, but they personally praised Chaucer heavily in their own poetry. Hoccleve himself, who probably knew Chaucer, in his poem, he includes a picture of Chaucer and says that, I'm worried that people will forget what he looks like, so I've included it here. And that's a picture that's, generally pretty widely known today. So it had an effect in memorializing him. And then, of course, looking forwards, many important English writers look back at Chaucer, responding to his works, adding to them, translating them, modernizing them. John Dryden, for instance, who calls him the father of English poetry, did a kind of translation of some of the Canterbury Tales. And then adaptations continue to appear to this day. Zadie Smith's play, The Wife of Willesden, is based on The Wife of Bath, which she translated when she was a student at Cambridge. So I think it's never been out of print. It's always been read, and many writers over the generations have responded to it.
And when did you yourself discover him, and was it love at first sight, or did it take a little while?
I think the first thing I read of Chaucer's was when I was at school. We did The Knight's Tale from the Canterbury Tales as a kind of set text, which is a somewhat challenging place to begin in a way. But I think I was always struck by had a fascination with the language, I suppose, the difference of Middle English to modern English. And it made me wonder, why was it so different? But I also just it appealed to me reading it in this unusual form, and the beauty of the poetry as well. And then also the kind of philosophical depth. It's a poem that asks big questions, and I found that intriguing as well.
And how did that initial spark then escalate into your career and your involvement with Chaucer today?
Yeah, well, I ended up writing my thesis for my PhD was on manuscripts of the Canterbury Tales, because there are There are about 50 odd complete manuscripts, about 80 odd if you include the fragmentary ones or ones with single tales. None of them date, as far as we can tell, from Chaucer's own lifetime, and they all differ hugely in terms of what they include, the order in which they set the tales. Chaucer died with it very much incomplete, and so his later compilers and scribes did their best to try and make some sense of what he left behind, but some of it was very contradictory. And I was just intrigued as to how one could sort of try and put that together, or what it told us about readers of Chaucer as well, why they were all so different, Chaucer's working methods and these kinds of things. So I've always been interested in the kind of textual editorial side of it. And then the linguistic side of it is something that I've always continued to have an interest in. In fact, the third edition of my book, Chaucer's Language, came out just last month, and it's another, that's really a book that tried to go back to exactly the questions I was sort of intrigued by when I was at school, which, why is his language so different, and also what do how can we read Chaucer now as sensitively as possible, given how different his language is from our own.
Well, I'm going to have to insist that you read us a little bit of Middle English later this episode. When I spoke to Julia, she said, "Oh, you got to get him to do that. It's really good." But I'm curious, what is or at least what are some of the theories as to the textual variants for the Canterbury Tales? Is he like Tolkien, who just constantly revised and added to his work?
There's an element of that, certainly. I mean, part of it is the Canterbury Tales was such a ambitious undertaking in that he has 30 pilgrims at the beginning, and at least 29, and then he adds one later on. The canon's yeoman joins the pilgrimage late, and the idea is that they're going to tell 2 tales on the way to Canterbury and 2 tales on the way back, so 120 tales. That is an ambitious project for a man quite late on in his years, and so there's evidence of alternative plans for the work. So at other times there's a reference to you have to tell 1 or more tales, and it also sounds a bit like the Parsons prologue might be the end of the work, as if he decided actually to scale it right down. And so there's evidence of lots of different plans lurking within what we've got left, which clearly suggests some kind of revision process, but whether he's expanding it or contracting it, it's unclear. And then for some of the individual tales, there are bits of text that don't appear in all of the manuscripts that might be later additions, or bits that he might have cut out. And then, of course, there's also the problem of many of the manuscripts appearing after his death meant that people did write their own tales to include them, either because they thought that it was necessary to try and make it more complete, or because they just thought it was a useful vehicle for their own writing. So that there's a lot of spurious material that gets written, and the links that join the tales, again, he didn't finish all of those, so it's not clear what order to put them in. And the linking passages clearly bothered some of the scribes because it made the thing look really obviously incomplete. And then there's also the things like the Cook's Tale, which has only really just got started when it gets left unfinished, and so other people tried to finish that off. So there's a whole variety of different responses to dealing with the problems of incompleteness, along with an author who also himself was something of a reviser.
Wow. Well, we'll talk about his influence on Lewis in a little bit, but what do we know of his own influences?
Well, I mentioned earlier that he travelled on the king's business, and one of the things we know is that he went to Italy at least once, and that seems to be what brought him into contact with some of the most important sort of Italian writers of the period. Boccaccio is probably the most important of these. And for instance, his work, Troilus and Crusade, his great love poem that he wrote in the 1380s, is closely based on Boccaccio's work, Il Filostrato. And Filostrato might remind C.S. Lewis readers of Dr. Filostrato.
Yes.
That hideous strength. Another one of these kind of little literary jokes. So that's really very closely based on Boccaccio, and he also worked with other works by Boccaccio as well. And in fact, the whole idea of the storytelling collection may well have come from the Decameron, which was a work by Boccaccio, that it was a collection of stories that emerged from a sort of fictional moment when a group of noble and Florentine men and women escaped the plague and leaving the city and got together and then told each other tales as a kind of tale-telling competition. So he was very influenced by Boccaccio. He was also influenced by Dante, Petrarch. So, for instance, Troilus' love song in Troilus and Cressade is a close rendering of Petrarch's sonnet, "If it's not love, what is this feeling?" And so he's deliberately translating some of these things, reworking some of these things. And this is very unusual in England at this point, for somebody to be so well read in Italian literature. He also was deeply indebted to the Roman de la Rose, the great medieval French allegorical work. Again, people who know Lewis's Allegory of Love, well, there's a whole chapter on this. That was hugely influential all across medieval Europe, but it's a work that Lewis was really, that Chaucer was really immersed in. In fact, he translated it, he tells us, into English. And that comes up in all kinds of contexts. Another work that's important for him is De Consolatione Philosophiae.
That work has appeared so many times on the influences of people in Jack's bookshelf. I'm just going to include it as a standard work at this point.
Right, that's so interesting. Yeah, well, Chaucer can go one better because he translated it into English.
Dang.
So yeah, he has a big claim to have been heavily influenced and be quite an important influencer in a sense, because of course then his translation becomes one of the ways which other people get to know it. But it's pretty foundational for him too, for the whole kind of philosophical depth that there is in works like The Knight's Tale or Troilus and Cressade, taking these kind of Kantian love stories, but adding this sort of element, this debate on things like predestination and fate. And a lot of that comes directly from Boethius. There are also English works that he knew from this period. So he's not just French and Italian, but to be honest, so I said he wasn't like the first person to write in English, but to be honest, they're kind of lesser literary works, lots of kind of popular romances, which were widely read probably. But when Chaucer does draw on them, he's mostly satirizing them. So there's a lovely moment in the Canterbury Tales, because he's one of the 29 pilgrims, Chaucer the Pilgrim. He's there very much as a kind of observer, describing everything to us, a kind of innocent eye narrator. And when it comes to his telling a tale, he tells an awful one about a knight called Sir Topaz, which is so terrible that the host has to stop it and says, you're dressed in rhyming. No more of this, he says. But in it, what he's doing is satirizing those very English romances that precede him. He references a number of them and then writes a version of them, which is just so truly awful that nobody can listen to it.
Well, we've mentioned quite a lot of his works as we've been filling out this background, but would you just mind giving us a chronological quick tour of what he produced and what his major works were?
Sure, yeah. I mean, it's difficult to know exactly what he wrote because, of course, we don't have a kind of CV. And I mentioned all the manuscript culture in which he was working because, of course, this is just before printing is introduced. So William Caxton set up the first printing press in England in 1475. And in fact, the Canterbury Tales is one of the first things that he prints. So it means that a lot of what we've got doesn't have title pages and attributions. And I said that people often added works by themselves and attribute them to Chaucer. So there's lots of spurious material too. But Chaucer was somewhat canny as well, in that he obviously recognized that it was important to establish his legacy. And so every so often in his works, he does give us a kind of account of things that can be attributed to him. So probably the best example of that is right at the end of the Canterbury Tales. And you're probably thinking, well, I thought it was unfinished. There isn't an ending. But there is kind of an ending when the parson tells his tale and sort of implies it's coming to an end. And then there's a thing that's called today the retraction, where Chaucer then seems to be offering us a kind of deathbed repentance, where he retracts all of his secular works and says, I don't want those to be counted against me. And I'm only interested in the holy works that I wrote that will be good for my soul. But he then, interestingly, goes on to detail exactly which works it is that he's concerned about. And it seems like he's just sort of establishing his CV at this point. And it includes things like the Book of Troilus. So this is the work Troilus and Crusade that I've mentioned already. He must have finished that by about 1387. So we don't know exactly when, but he finished it by then. We know that because he dedicates it to Moral Gower, which is his friend and fellow poet John Gower, and Philosophical Strode, who was a London lawyer and philosopher, which seems like an odd combination to us today. But he was also a fellow of Merton College, Oxford. He died in 1387, so one can assume that the book was finished before then. So that's probably his most important work, the Troilus and Crusade. He also mentions the Book of Fame, the House of Fame, which is a kind of dream vision work. The Book of the 25 Ladies. Now that's a thing called the Legend of Good Women. After he finished the Troilus and Crusade, or the Book of Troilus, as he calls it, which is the story of how Crusade betrays Troilus as a lover. This Legend of Good Women, he starts that with a prologue in which the god of love and his wife, the Queen Alceste, complain to him that he only ever writes things that make women look bad. And therefore he should write some stories of women who are good. And so he begins this thing called the Legend of Good Women, where he tries to do exactly that. But his heart doesn't really seem to be in it. And he never actually
He clearly got dumped shortly before this.
Yeah. So that's one of these unfinished works. And then the Book of the Duchess. That's interesting because that seems to be quite an early work, which he wrote as a consolation for John of Gaunt on the death of his wife, the Duchess Blanche. And that seems, in a way, to put him in that kind of orbit of royal patronage, where he seems to be able to write something specifically for a member of the royal family. But at the same time, it's a bit uncertain because it's not at all clear that it would have ever gone to John of Gaunt, or that certainly John of Gaunt didn't request it, and he doesn't seem to have ever acknowledged it. And the relationship between the poet and Gaunt himself seems that there's quite a distance between them socially. So he may have just written it in a hope to try and sort of bring himself forward for royal preferment in some way. And then there's also what he calls the Parliament of Birds, also known as the Parliament of Fowls, which is kind of bird debate poem on St. Valentine's Day, which is the day when all birds choose their mate. But actually the earliest literary reference to Valentine's Day being associated with love. And then he says the Book of the Tales of Canterbury, those that tend towards sin. So he's trying to revoke all of the ones that deal with sinful topics. And then finally also, and this is an interesting reminder that we don't know whether we've got everything that Chaucer wrote, everything survives, because he talks about the Book of the Lion. We don't know what that is. So again, there were things that he also says elsewhere that he translated what he calls the wretched engendering of mankind, which is a work by Pope Innocent III, which is the basis of the Man of Law's Tale. But he also says that he did a full translation of it. So there's probably quite a lot of Chaucer's work that doesn't actually survive. He wrote something on the life of St. Mary Magdalene as well, which would have been very appropriate for me if it had survived, but it doesn't seem to have done. So those are all his kind of sinful works. And then on the plus side, he talks about the translation of Boethius, and then any other books of legends of saints, homilies, morality, devotion, and so on. Rather unspecific when it comes to those. And in fact, many of those, it's not at all clear what he's referring to. There are some saints' lives in the Canterbury Tales. So the prioress, for instance, and the second nun tell saints' lives. And so he may be referring to those. But at the same time, that with Chaucer, his tongue is very often in his cheek, and you wonder to what extent actually this is just a way of itemizing all the things that he wants us to remember that he wrote.
Yeah, and it's like, I also wrote lots of religious stuff as well. You'll find it somewhere.
Exactly.
I do have to point out, since you mentioned the Parliament of Fowls, that Lewis does a pun on this in The Silver Chair. He mimics that in the title for chapter 4.
Yeah, the Parliament of Owls. Yes, exactly. Yeah, same idea. It's kind of a bird debate, I suppose. Yeah.
And storytelling. And since the Canterbury Tales is probably his most famous work, I think it's probably the one that most people will have at least heard of. Would you mind just setting the scene for that a little bit? What is this actually about, and how is it? You said that its structure is questionable because we're not quite sure in the order that everything should be in. But roughly, what is the framing device that he's using in this book?
It's a pilgrimage to Canterbury on which people who've gathered together to travel in one group are going to while away the time by telling each other stories. And it opens in a pub in Southwark in South London called the Tabard Inn.
See, this is a good British book.
Yeah, exactly.
Lewis tends to end his books at pubs. This one starts at it.
Yeah. So they're in the Tabard Inn. And the nature of pilgrimage in the medieval period is it did bring together all kinds of people from different social settings and groups, and from throughout the country, and they were all ready to go on this pilgrimage to Canterbury to the shrine of St Thomas a Becket. And the host, the landlord of the pub, is a chap called Harry Bailey, and he says to them, "Look, as we're going to do this journey all together, why don't we have this tale-telling competition? And the person who's judged to have told the best tale when we return will have a free supper paid for by the rest of the pilgrims." And they all agree to do that. And they draw straws. And the person who is elected to go first is the knight, which is hardly a coincidence because he's the person who's the highest in the social scale. And so they set off on the journey, and he tells his tale. At the end of it, the miller then says, "I'm going to go next." He's so drunk, he doesn't sort of allow for the social hierarchy, which should have meant that the monk would go next as the next most senior person. He butts in, disrupts it, and tells a tale of his own in his churl's terms, as the narrator says. He speaks like a churl, a lowly peasant. He gives a kind of very bawdy story, which responds quite directly to the knight's tale. And there's a kind of, there are certain bits of it where there's a clear correspondence between these linking passages that show the pilgrims responding to each other. But then there are breaks where there isn't anything that comes next, and it's not quite clear what tale should follow. But that's the basic structure of it, is that these pilgrims each tell tales as they go along. And the idea was that they would tell 120, as I say, there's not even one tale per pilgrim that survives.
And is there an overarching theme through these stories, or is it just a grab bag of whatever he was thinking of at the time?
There are obvious connections between some of them, and then there are some themes that seem to work their way through it. I mean, the quote that you opened with is quite relevant here, because it's about what Chaucer called maestry, or mastery, the relationship between men and women in marriage. And that quote is from the Franklin's Tale, which is often quoted as the sort of the resolution of what's known as the marriage debate that takes place across the Canterbury Tales, because they're all a whole group of them deal with this question about who should have the mastery in a marital relationship. The wife of Bath is probably the best known character for being highly disruptive there. She's had multiple husbands. She says that she was always in charge. It's sort of about the kind of the struggle for dominance within the marriage. The idea of the Franklin's Tale is that it's about complete equality in the marriage. So it starts off with a married couple who have decided that he's going to renounce the mastery and that they will be completely equal in everything, save in the name of sovereignty, the narrator adds, apart from the fact that he will let it be known publicly that he's in charge. And that strikes me as something slightly different. And actually what happens in that story is that as soon as that comes under pressure, the whole thing starts to fall apart and he starts to reassert his dominance. So that is a theme that works its way through it. And there are others as well, but sometimes they get disrupted in various ways.
Would you mind reading us one of your favorite passages?
Sure, yeah. I thought I'd start with the beginning because it's sort of, it's such a statement, I think. It sets the scene, but it does it in such a grand and impressive way that I couldn't resist beginning with that.
Okay.
Juan ad Aprilla with his sure sota, The drocht of March hath perced to the rota, and bathed every vein in switch liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Juan Zephyrus eke with his sway to breath, inspired hath in every holt and haith, the tendre corpus and the younger sunna, hath in the ram his half course irunna. And smaller foolers maken melodieë, that slepen al de nicht with open ear. So pricketh hem natuur in heer courages, than longen folk to go on pilgrimages, and palmers for to seken stronge strondes, to ferne halwes couth in sundre londes, and specially from every sheeres ende, of Engeland to Canterbury they wende, the holy blissful Marte for to seke, that hem hath holpen, when that they were seke.
It's so very pretty.
It's wonderful to say.
I'm also sure I'm not the only person who is now thinking of the Tolkien movies. When other people start,
that's right. Yeah.
it has a very similar sort of sound to it.
Yeah. And that's 18 lines, and that's just one sentence. And that's partly why I just think what a grand statement opening that is. And that's setting the scene, basically, the beginning of it. It's just basically saying it was April and it was time to go on pilgrimage. But he does it in such an impressive way.
That is really beautiful. All right, we've put it off for long enough. So the big question, how then did Chaucer influence C.S. Lewis?
Lewis wrote two major contributions to the study of Chaucer. The first, I think, is the essay that he published in 1932, What Chaucer Really Did to Il Filostrato, which I've also already mentioned as being the major source for Troilus and Cressade. And what Lewis does in that essay is basically a close comparison of the two. And he's arguing that Chaucer's contribution is first and foremost a medievalization of Boccaccio. And so he's looking at the different ways, for instance, that they handle the Troy story. And he says that Chaucer's really approaching it primarily as a historical poet, and that he's really interested in the story of Troy directly, whereas for Boccaccio, Troy is nothing more than a kind of background detail. And then he sees Chaucer as being interested mostly in medieval rhetorical theory. And so he's adding all these kind of medieval set pieces, amplifying and embellishing descriptions and adding apostrophes for various deities and so on. So that under Chaucer, the story becomes much more about a kind of moralistic and didactic one. And that's where Boethius comes in as well, the discussion of predestination and free will and so on, which is obviously another major striking difference between Chaucer's treatment of it and Boccaccio's. And so I think what Lewis felt about Chaucer was that he was trying to basically rewrite or correct Boccaccio's treatment of this story, because he wanted to bring it more in line with the courtly love code, and that he felt Boccaccio had made various sort of transgressions against that code. And that concept of the courtly love code is central to the second important contribution that Lewis made to Chaucer studies, which is the chapter that he wrote for The Allegory of Love, which was published a few years later in 1936, where again, here he sets out this concept of the courtly love code more fully, which he sees as being based around four principal features: humility, courtesy, adultery, and the religion of love. And then he thinks that Troilus and Cressade is the great fulfillment of all of this. The flourishing of this poetic genre is most explicitly clear in that work, the sort of pinnacle of achievement. And there's some lovely things in that chapter which sort of give you an insight into what Lewis thought of Chaucer. He talks about him as being a man of letters, a scholar, a poet. Chaucer was not a regular fellow, un vrai businessman or a Rotarian. He was a scholar, a courtier, and a poet living in a highly subtle and sophisticated civilization. So I think you really get a sense of how much he really appreciates Chaucer, how much he thinks that whole kind of that medieval culture is sort of epitomized in his work. And then he talks about the importance of reading Chaucer according to those more subtle and sophisticated conventions of Chaucer's age, rather than the kind of harsher, cruder realities of our own. So it's about the importance of understanding it within its context properly. But I think it's partly because living in a kind of industrial age, he felt that readers today or of his time struggled to read poetry written for a more scholastic and aristocratic one. And he says there's another lovely phrase, which I'll just quote. He says, "We must proceed with caution, lest our thick, rough fingers tear the delicate threads that we are trying to disentangle," which is just beautifully put. And I think, in a way, Lewis saw something of himself in Chaucer, I think, a sophisticated, scholarly poet, perpetuating and perfecting the allegorical love poem, enforcing and codifying the courtly love code, which is sort of what he obviously felt he was doing by writing the allegory of love in a way. So I think there is an element of that there. Those are really his two major contributions to the study of Chaucer.
And like Chaucer, he was also a busy man that was sent around the country, although Lewis was giving talks at the RAF rather than being on the King's business a little bit more directly.
Yeah, that's very true. Yeah. And of course, both now memorialised in Westminster Abbey.
Yeah, they're by each other.
In what we call Poets' Corner. But actually, of course, Chaucer was only buried there because he happened to be a member of that parish. That was just his local parish church. And it was only later that when they started burying other poets there, because Chaucer was there, that it became known as Poets' Corner. But yes, of course, now they both are.
I also read that Neville Coghill produced a translation of the Canterbury Tales.
He did, that's right, yeah.
So this is one of the other inklings.
Yeah, absolutely. He was. It was made for the BBC, in fact. I think it's part of the, of course, Neville Coghill was very involved in drama in Oxford and beyond. And he wrote what was actually an incredibly readable translation of it into modern English verse. It was read out on the BBC, published in 1952, and still in print today and widely used as a crib by students to read alongside the Middle English.
Yeah, I'll actually reread the section that you read earlier, so now people can actually understand what is being said. When in April the sweet showers fall, and pierce the drought of March to the root, and all the veins are bathed in liquor of such power as brings about the engendering of the flower, when also Zephyrus with his sweet breath exhales an air in every grove and heath, upon the tender shoots and the young sun his half course in the sign of the ram has run, and the small fowl and the making melody that sleep away the night with open eye, so nature pricks them and their hearts engages. Then people long to go on pilgrimages, and palmers long to seek the stranger strands of far-off saints hallowed in sundry lands, and specially from every shire's end of England down to Canterbury where they wend, to seek the holy blissful martyr, quick to give his help to them when they are sick. It happened that in that season, that one day in Southwark at the Tabard, as I lay, and then it goes on from there. In preparation for this, I looked at the Canterbury Tales, and it's like, this looks pretty, but I don't understand what it means. And then I found the Coghill translation, and I will definitely say I was very grateful for the opportunity to read and actually understand.
Yeah, it does a good job at that, doesn't it? And that was a good rendering of that passage. I mean, you can see that there are certain things like melody and I, which don't quite rhyme in modern English, and melody and open E in Middle English. And those are the kind of things that always intrigued me when I first started reading Chaucer. You think, well, what's happened to make that it doesn't rhyme now? And the same with when they were sick and seek, don't rhyme in modern English, but they did rhyme for Chaucer. And those kind of intriguing connections that was always made me interested in the linguistic side of things too.
I was reading Tiger, Tiger, Burning Bright to my son the other morning over breakfast, and there's a bit of a clangor of a rhyme in there that doesn't work no matter how you try it. So I just give up and let it happen. Symmetry, yes.
Yeah.
On this matter of translation and Middle English, did you learn Middle English by reading Chaucer? Is that how you do this?
It's certainly a good place to begin, I would say, because Chaucer, in a sense, was lucky that the London dialect that he wrote in is the one that formed the basis of our standard a sort of modern English variety. So it means that it's actually closer than it is to the language of some of his contemporaries who weren't from London. So a good example of that would be who we call the Gawain poet, who wrote Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, which is another it's sort of contemporary with Chaucer, but it was written by someone whose own native dialect was the Northwest Midlands. And consequently, that dialect is much harder for us to read now. And it's also an alliterative poem, which has its own kind of poetic diction, which is less well known today. So Chaucer is, in that sense, it's easier for us. That's maybe not a great. It doesn't. That doesn't help much if you find it very different. But it's an easier place to start, and that is how you sort of read yourself into Middle English. I think you probably need a glossary or a dictionary or something to look up some of the words that are just simply obsolete today, that are going to be cropping up commonly. Egg, for instance, meaning also, and these kinds of words that we're just unfamiliar with. And sometimes the spelling is confusing, but if you read it aloud, it suddenly becomes more apparent.
You get some clues.
And of course, modern English spelling is not so different from, we still spell it Knight, even though we no longer pronounce it Knicht. So that is a sort of helpful guide. And of course, sometimes the words that do survive mean something quite different today, and that can trip us up as well. So Chaucer uses the word silly to describe certain characters, meaning innocent or blessed. And these kinds of semantic changes, which again fascinated C.S. Lewis, and he writes about in Studies in Words. But yeah, they can make it mean they can make us trip up and misread, and that's what he's urging there in that quote that I gave from The Allegory of Love, that it's important to make sure we are reading it correct.
And so how would you recommend someone dip their toes into Chaucer? Would you recommend the Canterbury Tales, and what do they do about the language difference?
I think start with the Canterbury Tales, yes, because I think it's the most accessible. And the Troilus and Crusade, which is probably his great masterpiece, is huge. So the Canterbury Tales is huge too, but at least it's broken up into smaller units. And maybe something like The Miller's Tale, which is a really clever and funny story. It's somewhat bawdy, I should warn listeners.
They listen to myself, Matt and Andrew. They're fine.
Okay. But it's a really funny and clever story. Then you could follow up by doing it in the wrong order, but by reading The Knight's Tale, which is much longer and more complex. But you can see the deliberate connections and underminings and responses that happen between the two tales, where you get essentially a love triangle, but one presented as very courtly, lofty, kind of idealistic love, and the other being something much more kind of hands-on, should we say. That deliberate undercutting and responding to it adds a kind of level of depth and significance to the two tales, I think.
Okay, so Miller's Tale and The Knight's Tale. And speaking of The Knight's Tale, I could not let this interview conclude without me asking you, have you ever watched A Knight's Tale, the movie?
I did watch it, yes, some time ago. I don't remember being terribly impressed by it, or being very convinced it had much to do with the Chaucer that I knew.
Well, the director and writer, in an interview, he said that apparently Chaucer disappeared for 6 months at some point in his life, and nobody knows where he went. And so A Knight's Tale is what happened to Chaucer during that time, and that was his later inspiration for the Canterbury Tales.
I see. Yeah, there is a missing component in Chaucer's life record, so maybe that's it. Yeah.
There you go, everyone. Great Oxford scholar says A Knight's Tale is based on fact. I'll include a couple of links in the show notes if people haven't seen it. It's a fun popcorn movie, but it does have a very naked Chaucer in it for several points. Well, any closing thoughts before we wrap up?
One thing that we haven't mentioned, which is interesting to think about in relation to Lewis reading Chaucer, is Tolkien's contribution to Chaucer studies, because of course quite recently Professor John Bowers has uncovered all of this evidence of Tolkien editing Chaucer, again unfinished.
It's Tolkien, that did not need to be said.
Exactly. He spent decades editing his work, But also he did write an important essay on the Reeve's Tale, another good place to start potentially, comes after the Miller's Tale, in which Chaucer is the first time anyone has used dialect for literary purpose. He gives the two Cambridge undergraduate students northern dialects. And this was particularly of interest to Tolkien. And he gave a really important paper on it to the Philological Society in Oxford in 1931. And it was a very scholarly philological discussion of the use of the dialect. But what I think is really interesting about it is when it came out in published form in 1934 in the Society's proceedings, he called it Chaucer as a Philologist. And if we think about Lewis reading Chaucer, where you could see him as reading him as a scholarly poet rather than like himself, Tolkien, when he presents Chaucer, presents him as a philologist, very much like Tolkien himself. And he says at the beginning of that essay that Chaucer would have preferred the company of the Philological Society to the Royal Society of Literature. He would have preferred hanging out with an editor of the English Dictionary rather than a poet laureate. I don't know if Lewis attended that lecture, but if he did, I'm pretty sure he would not have agreed with the sentiment.
Yeah, I mean, from my very uninformed point of view, it does seem to be the central element of his work is that of a storyteller. And when I was preparing for this and thinking through Lewis's works, it's like, where do we get stories? I was thinking that we do get it in The Horse and His Boy. Now, up until now, I'd always thought of that as where Aravis is telling her story and Bree and Shasta tell theirs, perhaps more of an allusion to Arabian Nights, but maybe there is a little bit of Geoff Chaucer in there somewhere.
Yeah, stories on horseback, yeah.
Well, I hear the call for final drinks, so thanks again to Dr. Horobin for offering us this Oxford tutorial on Chaucer. Andrew and the C.S. Lewis Foundation will be in Oxford in July, so if you would like to join the tour with them, please just keep your ears open and subscribe to our newsletter because we'll be putting out details about that hopefully very soon. I may make it, but I have 3 children, so that might not happen. But thanks also to our stenographer Julia, to our sound engineers Taylor and Sarah, all our patron supporters, particularly our top-tier supporters. Ryan, Dan, Jody, Dave, Brian and Meg, Rebecca, Sarah, Mark, Kevin and Paul, Bud, James, Robert, Mark, Matt, Erica, Joelle, Amanda, Thomas, Shane, Becca, Paul, Gary, Stephen, John, James, Kate, Peter, Rowdy, David and Angela. And of course, thanks to all of you for listening. All of us co-hosts, we pray every single time we release an episode. And if you've enjoyed this episode, why not pick up a copy of the Canterbury Tales and have a read? And failing that, just go watch The Knight's Tale. And please join us again next time, when we'll continue going further up
and further in.
Cheers!
Cheers.